The crash of Air France Flight 447 is often called the Titanic of the skies. These two tragedies happened nearly a century apart, but they share some creepy similarities. In both cases, hundreds of lives were lost. In both cases, ice was one of the culprits behind the terrible tragedies. And just like the Titanic sank on its first voyage across the Atlantic, Flight 447 faced disaster flying over the same ocean. It was May 31st, 2009. Flight 447 took off from Rio de Janeiro and headed for Paris, carrying 228 people on board, passengers and crew members. The flight was supposed to continue for about 10 hours, and 3 pilots were to take turns controlling the plane. Everything seemed to be going smoothly for about 3 hours, until the plane approached the region of the Atlantic known for its unpredictable, wild weather. At around 2 a.m. UTC, things started to get bumpy. The plane hit a really rough patch and severe turbulence started immediately. But that wasn't the worst thing. Ice crystals started forming on the pitot tubes, and those little gadgets are crucial for measuring airspeed. When they got blocked, the autopilot disengaged. The pilots had to take control manually. That's when the flight system switched to alternate law mode, which took away some of the safety protections the pilots usually relied on. It was the moment when things went terribly sideways. First Officer Bonin, who was at the controls at the time, panicked during the turbulence and pulled the nose of the plane up. Sadly, it was definitely not what you'd want to do in that situation. The sudden shift made the plane lose speed shockingly fast and triggered a stall warning. Inexplicably, instead of bringing the nose down to pick up speed again, Bonin kept pulling up. It sent the plane climbing steeply to 38,000 feet. It was way higher than it should have been. In a moment, the machine went into its fatal plunge. In the cockpit, chaos broke out. The plane stalled, alarms were blaring, and the crew was at a loss about what was going on. For some bizarre reason, Bonin kept yanking the nose up, making things even worse. The stall warnings went for quite a bit, but it just added to the confusion. Captain Dubois, who had been resting, got back to the cockpit. He understood the situation was dire. He shouted at his colleagues to push the nose down, but it was already too late. For over 3 agonizing minutes, the plane was in free fall towards the ocean. During that time, the crew's actions canceled each other out. Bonin was pulling the stick back, while his teammates tried to push it forward. As a result, the plane stayed in a stall the whole way down, spiraling from 38,000 feet to sea level in a terrifying dive. The final moments were captured on the cockpit voice recorder. "We've lost all control of the airplane. We don't understand anything. We've tried everything." That was what one of the pilots was shouting. At 2:14 a.m. UTC, the Airbus A330 slammed into the ocean belly first at a speed of about 175 miles per hour. None of the 228 people on board survived the collision. The flight recorders, which stopped just seconds before the crash, showed that the plane's nose was still pitched upward when the aircraft hit the water. The pilots never really got control back after the stall. After the crash, the investigation showed that small issues could turn into a huge disaster in no time. The blocked pitot tubes were actually a minor problem, but they set off a chain reaction that overwhelmed the pilots. Experts remarked that the confusion in the cockpit and the pilots' struggle to understand what had been happening had played a big role in the crash. The tragedy also raised alarms about pilot training, especially for high-altitude stalls, leading to changes in aviation safety protocols. Surprisingly, this disaster isn't the only one compared to the tragedy of the Titanic that occurred in the sky. The story of R101 Airship is one more catastrophe that got the same name. The airship's voyage was meant to be a symbol of Britain's future in air travel, but it all came crashing down, sadly, literally, on its first big journey. By October 1930, the R101 had been through some major upgrades. The plan was to fly it from England to India. It was supposed to be a huge journey that would show off what the airship could do. That's why there was a lot of pressure to get it in the air. But there was a problem. The airship hadn't been tested enough, and some experts thought it wasn't ready yet. Still, the mission was greenlit. A big deal about this flight was that Lord Thomson, who was the head of Britain's Air Ministry and a huge supporter of the airship project, was going to be on board. He was determined to make the trip a success and gather support for the Imperial Airship Scheme, Britain's dream of using airships for long-distance travel across the empire. So, along with other important officials, engineers, and crew members, Lord Thomson boarded the R101 for what they hoped would be a historic flight to India. Little did they know about the tragedy that would happen soon. On the evening of October 4th, the R101 lifted off from Cardington, England. The plan was to head to France, refuel there, and then continue the journey to India. But right from the start, things didn't go great. The weather was bad, with rain and strong winds. It made the massive airship difficult to control, plus it already had some technical problems that hadn't been fully solved. The airship's engines were diesel-powered, which was a safer option because they weren't as likely to catch fire as gasoline engines. But at the same time, they weren't strong enough for such a huge, heavy airship. Anyway, despite warnings about the bad weather, they pressed on. The R101 crossed the English Channel and headed towards France. But as the weather worsened, the airship started losing altitude. It just couldn't stay up. By the time they were flying over Beauvais, northern France, the situation was getting critical. The airship was too heavy, especially after being hit by the rain, and was having a really hard time staying in the air. At around 2 a.m., it began descending too fast. The crew did everything they could to make the ship start climbing again. No use. At 2:09 a.m., disaster struck. The R101 hit the ground in a field about 50 miles from Paris. But it wasn't the worst. When the collision occurred, the airship's fabric tore open, and the hydrogen inside, an extremely flammable gas, caught fire. Within moments, the entire ship was engulfed in flames. Out of the 54 people on board, 48 didn't survive, including Lord Thomson and many of Britain's top aviation experts. Only 6 survivors made it out, but not unscathed. So what went wrong? Again, it was a mix of problems. For one thing, design flaws. The R101 was too heavy, even after all the upgrades. Its engines weren't strong enough to handle such a weight, especially in bad weather. Which takes us to the next issue. Flying on a stormy, windy night. It only made things worse. The rain added extra weight, causing the airship to lose even more lift. Like many airships of the time, the R101 was filled with incredibly flammable hydrogen gas. Right after the disaster, it caused a fire to spread too quickly to handle. Finally, there were a lot of those who thought the R101 wasn't ready for such a demanding trip. But certain pressure pushed the flight forward despite its many technical issues. The crash of the R101 marked the end of Britain's airship era. The Imperial airship scheme was scrapped after the tragedy, and the British authorities decided to give up on airships altogether. There was a public inquiry, and the conclusion was clear. The R101 wasn't fit to fly that far. It had been rushed into service, and the decision to go ahead with the flight, even in bad weather, was a huge mistake. The crash of the R101 serves as a cautionary tale about pushing technology too far, too fast, without proper testing.